Hello. I'm going to start this presentation off by giving you about 10 seconds. I want you to take a look at the cartoon that is on the screen and just soak it in, internalize it, and think about what this means for education and assessment in education. So we are here today to reflect on and reimagine assessment in education. I'll be talking today about the abolition of standardized tests. My name is Anthony Perdue. I am a master's candidate at the School of Education of Johns Hopkins University. And today we will be reflecting and reimagining assessment in education. Let's jump into it. So I want to start by giving you all a little overview of what this is going to be like. For this presentation, I'm going to start by talking about an oppression framework. Then I'm going to move on to giving you a little bit of a literature review so that you can see what kind of sources are being used throughout this presentation. Then we're going to move on to reflecting on the United States education system by looking at essentially the history of how education has been used and how assessment has been used in the United States. And then we're going to move on from the reflecting piece to the reimagining half of this presentation, where we are going to reimagine what assessment could look like in this country, in the United States, by re-examining standardized tests as tools of oppression, discussing really what it means to abolish standardized tests, and then we are going to move into a recommendation being a performance-based assessment. Then we will conclude. So the reason that we want to start with oppression and setting up this framework is because if we are ever going to create an educational system that is equitable and that is anti-oppressive, we need to understand what oppression is, and that understanding needs to be at the heart of the work that we are doing so that we can create systems that unpack that and deconstruct that. Today, I'll be using a framework about oppression from Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. Particularly, this framework comes from a section from Leigh Ann Bell, where she describes the features of oppression as pervasive, meaning that it is going to keep coming back, restricting, meaning that it is limiting, hierarchical, meaning that it is creating a system that is pervasive in creating this system, that some are above others. And then it is complex with multiple and cross-cutting relationships, meaning it is intersectional. It is not just a race thing, it is not just sexual orientation, it is not just gender, but oppression lives throughout multiple identifiers and identities. And then finally, Bell shares with us in their framework that it is internalized. And so let's keep this framework in mind, because all of these things are going to pop up when we start to talk about how assessment and how standardized tests have been used as tools for oppression. This is the understanding of oppression that we need to have in order to understand and really walk through the rest of this presentation. So let's jump forward. As I go through this literature review, I do want to share all of the sources that I'm using with you. I want to be completely crystal clear that this is where I'm getting my information. I talked about Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice by Adams, Bell, and Griffin. That is what I'll be using for my oppression framework. I will also be using a variety of sources. I'll be using and citing educational research-based texts. You can see that as Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, but also in Latson, Billings, just what is critical race theory and what is it doing in a nice field like education. And also Kahn's work in the case against standardized tests. All of those sources are super, super important for grounding us in this work because as we think about assessment, we want to constantly be thinking about race and oppression and all of those things as we think about and try to reimagine what a more equitable assessment model could look like. I've also cited other internet blogs and articles and even videos starting with O'Brien's 5 ways ESSA impacts standardized testing. I'm also going to discuss the Carlisle Indian School that is mentioned and discussed in Little's text, how boarding schools tried to kill the Indian through assimilation. And then I'll also be particularly looking at one case study of a school, Garfield High School in Seattle, Washington, to really think about, again, how assessment is being used to perpetuate oppression. So we're going to jump into our part of this presentation where we are reflecting on the United States and education in the United States. And we must start with Indigenous people in the United States. We must start with the Indigenous peoples of this land. That's super, super important to start with because they were the first people here upon contact with European colonizers. And given they were the first people here on this land, occupying this land, we really get a good picture of how the US education system is created by how colonizers, European colonizers who created this country, we get a good picture of what our education system looks like by looking at how the white European colonizers interacted with the indigenous Native Americans. This example gives us a clear example of how white supremacy is rooted in and ingrained in our education system. And so we start with the Carlisle Indian School, and this is even later in US history. This is in the late 19th century, but the Carlisle Indian School taught us this idea that we must kill the Indian in him and save the man. The concept is to eliminate all parts of the culture and then to save the man by converting people into whiteness or white culture and European white dominant culture. So that is the goal. That was the goal from much of our education system from the beginning. We didn't even see, I'm not gonna go down that road, but we didn't see African-American students in the full public education system until after integration in 1954, and even that took a while. And so we see that our education system from the beginning has been created and designed to eliminate cultures that do not align with whiteness and white supremacy and Eurocentric cultures. We see that from the very beginning in the foundations of our country that there is a hierarchy that is being created as to which cultures are appropriate and are going to be taught at school and which ones are not. You can see in Little's text, she discussed how students were taught to not speak their native language, not to practice their native religions, and to really essentially abandon their way of life. I would argue that many students of color, especially in predominantly white institutions, but even in urban education and in predominantly Black and brown schools, students are coming to school and being taught and told that they must eliminate parts of who they are in their culture and their identity in order to be successful at school. So if we think about how the Carlisle Indian School set up our education system, it really is no surprise that when we get to No Child Left Behind, we see that standardized tests are being weaponized. Under this system, schools were being held accountable, which is amazing. We want to hold schools accountable for success in their students' achievement. But students were being held accountable, and their consequence was the loss of funding when their students did not meet adequate yearly progress. Now, this is an issue because, as we've already established, our country is founded upon racism and hierarchies of whiteness and hierarchies on race. And so with an education system that is based on that, when we create assessments that penalize schools for not achieving adequate yearly progress, we are creating a system in which the schools that we know that already do not have the access to resources are not going to perform as well as schools that have resources. In the United States, those different types of schools are often correlated with race. Schools that, like the one I work at, are mostly Black and brown in terms of student population, but do not have the same resources that a white school would have in a more well-off environment. And so No Child Left Behind created this system in which standardized tests were really a weapon to shut down schools and communities where there was a lack of resources, most often Black and brown communities and low-income communities. If we flash forward just a little bit to 2013, we see that at Garfield High School, teachers had finally had it. At Garfield High School, the MAP assessment was being used as a measure for teacher compensation. Students were not being held accountable for their scores on this assessment in any way. And so it was really just used to be weaponized against teachers. This also is being used to weaponize against students, even though not directly impacting their grade. What the MAP assessment is doing is creating a narrative about what students are capable of in a small window of time. Especially in a small window of time and on an assessment that they have no investment in because it doesn't count toward their grade, it doesn't count toward anything. And so what we can see from the example at Garfield High School is that assessments, standardized tests like the MAP assessment can be and are often weaponized against teachers, students, and they're used to create narratives that, that validate ideas that put some people at lower levels of the hierarchy and some people at higher levels of the hierarchy. Standardized tests like the MAP assessment are used to justify racial caste systems, class caste systems. And so in 2015, President Barack Obama signed the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so when we think about this particular piece of legislation, this was our federal government's governing of the K-12 education system. The way standardized tests were discussed in this legislation is that essentially they were no longer tied to access to resources. Schools were no longer losing funding because they were not performing on assessments. However, this does not take it far enough. The access to resources is not the only issue, it is not the only equity issue, it is not the only oppressive issue with standardized tests. And so ESSA, it had huge improvement, and it has been a huge improvement on our education system in the United States. However, it still does not eliminate standardized tests. However, what it does allow for, and this is the beauty of ESSA, is that it allows states to have more flexibility with the standardized tests that they use to assess students statewide. So every state now has the ability to choose which assessment they want to use at the state level to assess their students' achievement. That's beautiful. However, we must reimagine what assessment can look like in order to create anti-oppressive education systems. We want to start by abolishing standardized tests. I want to bring us back to our oppression framework because I'm going to connect standardized tests to this framework. Standardized tests are pervasive. We have them every year. They are used to restrict access. We've seen that with Garfield High School, how standardized tests have been used to restrict access. We even see that today with the ACT and SAT. Although it is used to measure student achievement and it is used to measure student ability, it is then weaponized against those students to restrict them on the options that they have available to them. Whether that be scholarship money for college, or the classes that they are now able to take as a result of their score. It also creates a hierarchy, right? We even see specific numbers used on these assessments, and they are used to track students into which part of the hierarchy they fit into. Are you a student who has a 12 on the ACT, or are you a student who has a 29 on the ACT? And that is used to create a hierarchy of how we are going to then treat these students. And it is also complex, right? Like, it is hard to imagine that standardized tests could be oppressive. This is so deeply ingrained into our culture and our country. It is physically impossible to create a standardized test that is culturally relevant and is anti-oppressive. The reason for that is because standardized tests are created to a standard. They're created based upon what one group of people, particularly usually an upper class group of people, is based on what they deem to be important for lower class people, or people lower in the hierarchy, people lower in the racial caste system. It is designed to keep them in their place. And it is designed to, again, justify oppression. So this is a super complex topic, and there's literally just no way to create a test that accounts for all the many cultures and identities that exist in our world. There's no way. There's also no way, because standardized tests are created for students to demonstrate what they know based on what the assessor is assessing them on. What this then does is lead to a lot of internalized oppression across our entire country. There's so many people in the United States who, due to standardized tests, have internalized their place in the hierarchy. Because I cannot score a higher number on ACT, I'm going to just be okay with being a C or D student. It is then internalized for our students that they are in this particular place in the hierarchy because they earned this particular score. And that translates throughout all standardized tests. And so, for keeping that oppression framework in mind, assessment is a tool for maintaining oppression. When we think back to the Carlisle Indian School, students were being assessed on things that were outside of their culture. If I am an indigenous student who comes from whatever tribe I might come from, right? I might speak a different language, I might practice a different religion, but if I come to school and I am being assessed on the language that is not mine, I'm being assessed on the culture that is not mine, I am not going to be set up to have to achieve high student outcomes. Like, I'm not going to have high outcomes because there's a mismatch. And I want to acknowledge that some students of diverse cultures are able to take standardized tests from the dominant group and do well. And I want to connect that a little bit, and I don't want to make this a direct connection, but there's definitely a correlation. But many people of color and people of oppressed identities learn an ability to code switch. We learn to turn off the parts of ourselves that do not align with whiteness and white supremacy in our education system. And so we turn that off in order to achieve well, in order to perform well on the assessments. If we're going to think about education through a lens of equity and oppression, we need to think about race. And for critical race theorists, intelligence testing has been a movement to legitimize African-American student deficiency under the guise of scientific rationalism. These assessment measures, crude by most analyses, may tell us that students do not know what is on the test, but fail to tell us what students actually know and are able to do. If we are going to live in a more equitable society, we must take what students are able to do and work from there. We should not be seeking to learn what our students are unable to do all the time. If assessments are not telling us what our students are capable of, that we are not able to reach out to that student and pull out their maximum potential because we don't know what it is. I have many students who are artists. I have students who are athletic. And if I am assessing them in this one particular way in a standardized test, they're not able to demonstrate to me everything that they are able to do related to my content. I can create assessments, and this is where we're going to get into the reimagining piece. We can create assessments and we can reimagine what an assessment looks like, where students are able to demonstrate what they know versus just being told what they don't know based on a standardized test. And so we're going to reimagine assessment in education. We need to abolish a standardized test. ESSA should be revised to include an abolition of standardized testing because it is a tool of white supremacy. It is a tool of oppression, as we have seen via the framework. The abolition of standardized testing does not mean just no more assessment, no, we're done. No, that is not what that means. The abolition of standardized testing means a shift. It means a revolutionary shift to a better assessment model, and a better assessment model would be a performance-based assessment. One example of what some examples of what a performance-based assessment could be are conducting an experiment in a language class, speaking in a foreign language, writing a play. I've even had students organize a protest in class. I had students organize a rally in class, and we invited parents and community members, but there are means of assessing students' understanding of the content and skills that can be based on performance. That also makes our assessment stronger because students are using the skills that they are learning in our class and translating that into an actionable thing that they can do. This also is much better, and I would be remiss if I skipped over this, but this also is much better for our students with disabilities. For too long, our special education system in the United States has failed students with disabilities, and for a variety of reasons. If students with disabilities were able to engage in a performance-based assessment, they would be able to use the skills that they do have, the abilities that they are able to contribute. They can maximize that and use that to demonstrate what they know of the content or what they're learning in school on a performance-based assessment. This gives us a better picture of what students are able to do and what they are not able to do compared to a standardized test that tests students based on what they know of one particular way of thinking. I would highly recommend, and I would honestly in part attribute this to my participation in the Johns Hopkins School of Education Master's Program, but I would highly recommend a performance-based assessment called a portfolio. The reason why I love this model of assessment so much and why I think it is the best shift for students across the country and can be scaled down to different grades is because students are collecting what they have done over a period of time. It is not just a small snapshot that a standardized test does, but it is an assessment over a larger period of time. It is doing what an assessment is supposed to do, and it is showing us what students are capable of doing. And so it assesses students based on what they are capable of doing by collecting what they've done over a period of time. They're placing those materials into one centralized location and then doing analysis. They're doing metacognitive thinking. They're doing metacognitive analysis on their work. They're doing analysis on the things that they have done. This helps our students to not only improve on the things that they have done, but also to have one centralized place to see the journey of their learning. I want to conclude by bringing us back to the same image that we started with. For a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Much like this man here in the seat, as teachers, we show up to schools every day, and we ask this of a room or in 2020, or a Zoom room full of students who have varying abilities, varying skills that they could demonstrate for us, but we are not looking at the full scope of our students. We are mostly just looking at what they're able to do on a standardized test. We must shift away from white supremacist assessment models that create hierarchies of ability. Our nation is truly founded upon the social construction that whiteness and white adopted cultures are superior to all others. If we are to truly begin creating a more equitable education system, that should start with our assessments. The same way as teachers, we start our instruction by starting with the assessment. We need to start to revolutionize our education system by starting with assessments. Instead of using standardized assessments like MAP, ACT, SAT, or in my amazing home state, New Jersey, NJ-SLAY or NJ-SLA, we should shift completely to a performance-based assessment model that would allow students to demonstrate what they know and are able to do with content, knowledge, and skills. We could then track this over the course of an entire school year to really get a full, meaty picture of what our students are able to do. This would benefit students of all cultures and all abilities. It would make our education system a more leveled playing field. This, moving to a more performance-based assessment model across the country, would be the revolutionary act that the United States education system needs. Here are my sources one more time. Thank you for listening. Abolish standardized tests, and I am out.